So, everyone, good evening and welcome to this lovely spring evening in Northumberland County. I'd just like to say, for those of you who got a couple of emails from me, where we lived, there was a foot of snow last night. So it was legitimate. And then we drove down to Coburg and said, oh, okay, we're fine. We can go ahead. My name's Elizabeth Ivory. I'm the chair of Northumberland Learning Connection. I know most of you, but I see some new faces and welcome. We're so happy that you joined us this evening. Let me first make our land acknowledgement. This place where we gather tonight is in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. Tonight is the first event in our spring series on migration, how movement changes the world. About a year ago, when the program committee proposed this topic at a board meeting, I put my hand up and said two words: Doug Saunders. Like many of you, I have followed Doug's writing in the Globe and Mail for years, and I am finding his current series on migration pathways just riveting. Doug is also the author of 3 books: Arrival City, The Final Migration and Our Next World, The Myth of the Muslim Tide, and Maximum Canada, which you can get at Furby's. Or Let's Talk Books in Coburg. For most of COVID, Doug was a resident fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. And in 2022, he designed a self-integration framework for urban migrants on behalf of the International Organization for Migration. Doug served as the Globe's London-based European bureau chief for a decade, after having run the paper's Los Angeles bureau, and has written extensively from East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and North Africa. You may know from reading his work in the Globe that he only recently returned from a month in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Doug and his partner, journalist and author Elizabeth Renzetti, who is here with us tonight, live in Toronto, and we're delighted to have an excuse to visit Coburg, especially at this time of year. This morning, Liz was on a Zoom call with the Coburg Library where they were discussing her newest book. And so I'm showing it to you tonight. But what we're going to talk about now is Doug's informative presentation that he's prepared just for NLC on the subject of who's coming to Canada's border. Doug, over to you.
So can everybody hear me? Okay, now you can. That's good. Thank you. And there we've got the slide. This is really fortunate and timely that Elizabeth's interests lined up with what I happen to be doing. And I'd like to thank everyone here for giving me the opportunity to formulate my thoughts. As Elizabeth said, during the last year and a half, I've had the privilege to spend many weeks traveling each of the world's major human migration, you could say crisis migration pathways. And I'm starting, it helped clarify a lot of things for me, which we'll talk about. Of the hundreds of people I've met along the way, some of them have been headed toward the southern borders of Europe or the United States or Canada, most often because they were left with no other route. And you often hear these days that there's a migration crisis in the world. And it's a little unclear what that means. And this experience has made me realize that, yes, there is a migration crisis, but it's not the one most people think it is. And it's both a temporary crisis that didn't exist a few years ago, and basically an artificial crisis, one that could be solved if countries like ours and similar wealthy countries made different decisions and helped other countries in different ways and managed things. when we hear there's a migration crisis, we tend to think about people crossing borders. And indeed, during the 2 years since the pandemic shutdowns ended, there have been record numbers of people crossing, walking and swimming and taking boats across borders irregularly. So here in the southern United States, and the southern border of the United States, during the last 2 years, there have been record numbers of people crossing the Rio Grande and other border crossings, largely Venezuelans, Haitians, and other people who've made their way. We'll talk about the specifics of that later. The Mediterranean passageways to Europe have seen not record numbers, but numbers approaching what we saw in the early 2000s when that particular traffic began. And again, really tragic numbers of deaths on the Atlantic around the Canaries and on the Mediterranean routes. And Canada, of course, has had an increase of foot traffic across its border between official crossing points, to the point that it's become, from time to time, a political crisis. Talk of shutting down Roxham Road. Will that drive people to more dangerous places? There have been people who've died trying to cross in the snow during the winter, others who've had amputations and that sort of thing. And so there's the risk. And of course, we've learned recently that, and what a lot of experts in the field have known all along, that the larger traffic actually is people flying to Canada on visas and trying to sneak south across to the United States. And in fact, a lot of the policies around the Canadian border, such as the Safe Third Country Agreement, were negotiated because the United States was worried about people coming from Canada across into their territory. It goes both ways. At the same time as we hear this, we hear that there is a lot of migration and a lot of immigration, and wars and economic stuff and climate change. And there's a sense that some people get that we're seeing some kind of deluge, that people are going to be flooding out of broken countries, out of poverty, and assailing the borders of wealthy countries. And this is going to get worse and worse, and that we need to do something to stop it. In fact, that larger thing, most immigration is not a crisis, is not at record levels, is very manageable. About something like 85% of all of the immigration cross-border movement that takes place around the world right now is normal legal migration, where somebody gets a visa and flies to an airport or a citizenship application or something like that, and so on. And there are not a record number of immigrants. Right now, about 3% of the people in the world live in a country that they weren't born in, so are immigrants. And that hasn't changed by much during the last 70 or 80 years. So here we see a terrible pie chart, but about 83% of the people in the world are non-migrants. 13% are people who've migrated within their country, internal migrants. And then that darker triangle, 3.3% of the people in the world are international migrants who are living somewhere else. And refugees is 0.3%. So about a tenth of total immigration is refugees or crisis migrants of various sorts. That percentage also hasn't changed much, but what has changed is, particularly in the last 2 years, is the number of these crisis migrants and the number of what I call road people, which is people who for various reasons are moving, who've had to leave the country they live in, and don't yet have a place that will allow them to live or a known safe destination. There are really extraordinary numbers of people in this situation, such as these Venezuelans. I met in this family of mainly women, literally on a road in Colombia. Um, and um, and we are seeing probably the highest number of refugees in the world that the world has seen since the Second World War. I mean, at the end of the Second World War, most Europeans were refugees of one sort or another, and so on. But certainly since then, this is refugee levels around the world since 1977, and we had some big peaks in the 1990s with the wars in the former Yugoslavia. And then, interestingly, in the 2000s, when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were going on, there was pretty much very little, almost no major refugee flows around the world for that entire decade. There were other economic movements that were regular. And then the Syrian war created that crisis in Europe in 2015-16. And then during the pandemic years, nobody moved across borders. And then two things happened after that. Three things, really. The end of pandemic controls caused a lot of people from failed states, especially Venezuela, to start moving and try to find a place to settle, including going to the southern borders of the United States and Canada. The second Russian invasion of Ukraine began and sent something like 8 million people into Europe, 200,000 of them to Canada eventually. And of course, in the summer of 2021, the United States pulled out of Afghanistan and sent 1.6 million people fleeing the Taliban as they took over. So that's what you see, that big spike on the right. But I would include this population. I use the word road people because the word in Spanish language, and I'm not fluent in Spanish, for the 8 million Venezuelans who've had to leave their country since it became a failed state, is the caminantes, which is a Spanish word that usually in usual vocabulary it means walker, someone who's walking, but it also literally means people of the road, and they really are people of the road, many of them, and so on. We'll get into them in a little bit. So the road people, I would include refugees, but I would also include a lot of people who are on the move for economic reasons, but because of immigration and border policies, they have to become irregular migrants, illegal immigrants, and so on, because they have work that people want to do, but they have no way to get a visa or something like that. That's who gets on the boats across the Mediterranean and so on. So when I say it's a limited problem, both in time and in geography, I mean that. The refugees on the road, this record number of refugees, 3/4 of them are coming from 5 countries, from Colombia, Sudan, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Syria. Afghanistan, Syria have produced 6 million or something like that each. Venezuela, about 8 million, Ukraine, about 9 million or something. This chart's a little outdated. And not only that, but 4 out of 10 of them are hosted in only 5 countries. In Pakistan, Turkey, Uganda, Colombia, and Germany. Although that chart doesn't show Poland, which actually, Poland got 1.5 million Ukrainians originally, and Germany 1 million, so that's not occurred. Anyway, there is not a lot of war in the world right now. There is not a lot of wars. There are only a handful of countries that have serious war right now. Only a handful of countries that are seriously failed to the point that everyone has to flee. But those countries are producing record numbers of people on the road. Not a record percentage of the human population, but a record number. This is a useful map. Don't worry, I'm not just showing you maps all night. We'll get past that. this is a usual map showing the size of refugee populations in various countries. They're showing Venezuelans in red because they're not legally refugees. They're not fleeing a war. They're fleeing a failed state that was taken over by a corrupt autocracy that wrecked the economy and forced everyone to leave. But you get a sense that what's called a refugee crisis in some countries, particularly in the United States and Canada, pales in comparison to, for example, the 3.5 million Venezuelans that Colombia has welcomed and made into, given schooling and healthcare, and welcomed the 6 million Afghans who are living in Pakistan, and the extraordinary numbers of both Syrians and Afghans who are living in Turkey. Among Western countries, I mean, Germany has an extraordinary number of refugees in it because it had both the million people who entered their country during the 2015-16 migrant crisis, about half of whom have stayed and who are recognized as refugees. And of course, also they hosted the most Ukrainians after Poland and so on. But there's not any other European country that has anywhere close to those numbers. Canada came very close on Ukrainians. We've hosted 200,000 Ukrainians, which is more than a lot of Western European countries have, in good part because, of course, there's something like 3 million Canadians who are of Ukrainian heritage and who've, you know, it's sort of seen as a family matter here. But so to say that any Western country is overwhelmed right now is not quite the case. The problem is not those circles, though. It's the millions of people who are stuck between those circles without an easy or legal way to get to a place where they can live and be safe and raise their families. And that huge population is in good part a result of policy decisions. And to understand that, let me take you through some of the routes I've followed recently and the types of crisis migration that drive those routes. So most recently, just in February, I spent the month in Pakistan following Afghans, especially those who had to leave after the Taliban took over in 2021. Now, Pakistan, for most of the last 50 years, has been sometimes proud to call itself the most refugee-filled country in the world. Turkey now challenges it for that, but it's certainly held the title for longer, and it's had millions of mainly Afghan refugees for a very, very long time. They started coming after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the early 1980s, and they were welcomed for decades, actually, as brothers from the same cultures and languages and religions and so on, and generally allowed to move freely across those borders and move back and forth. The shifts were in the millions, but there wasn't really any restrictions. Since the Taliban took over and since Pakistan's military government became much more controlling of the country, there's been a growing intolerance of the Afghans there and a desire to push them out. Partly because the military leadership of Pakistan is of the mentality that, well, the Taliban are the natural government of Afghanistan. We never really liked the NATO allies there, and why don't these people go back to live in the country that suits them, and that sort of thing. It contradicts the Pakistani constitution, which, like Canada's constitution, says if you're born on the soil, you're a citizen. But that's not recognized by any of the authorities there. They do not recognize the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Afghans there as being legal citizens. So they started a mass deportation in October last year, and they successfully deported some number in excess of 300,000 Afghans back across the border, or caused them to return to avoid deportation. And a lot of them, to avoid it, And now they've just announced a second round of deportations where they hope to deport another 500,000 Afghans. Iran is theoretically trying to deport its millions of Afghans as well. This is incentivizing a lot of them to leave. I mean, it's a real pincher. Families either live in hiding, and I met a lot of families like Maria here who have to leave, do not leave their 1 or 2 room apartments. These are mostly middle class families who lived in big compounds and had lives a lot like ours in Afghanistan until summer of 2021. We're educated professionals. She was an intelligence officer with the Afghan intelligence service under the elected government, and therefore had to leave very quickly. So she took what's known as the donkey route. They've called this forever the donkey route. It's kind of the old Silk Road. Nobody knows if the word donkey is mispronunciation of the English word donkey or whether it's from a Punjabi word that means hopping from place to place. But the idea of having smugglers take you all the way across Iran and then across the Turkish border and then across Turkey and into Europe has long been a means of passage into Europe. It is an incredibly dangerous thing now. I mean, they have whole graveyards in Turkey of migrants who've been killed along the way. The rates of assault of people along that route are grievous. And it's also very expensive. You pay a series of smugglers. I met some of the smugglers who don't tend to be criminal. They're just people who enable things. But it will cost you $3,000 per family member if you make it all the way. And this is one thing: is that the people who make these dangerous, irregular crossings, the boats across the Mediterranean, the crossing Mexico by foot, and the Rio Grande, and crossing Iran and Turkey. All of those crossings will cost you several $1,000s per person if you don't want to get killed by a gang or kidnapped or something like that. And so it tends to be a middle class group or a skilled trades group who are able to do that, who are able to save the kind of money to get on a rubber raft and that sort of thing. People who back in the country they were not goat farmers. That sort of thing. There is another group, which is sort of adventure-seeking young men who are mixed into that group. And one of the consequences of not having a way out of that pressure cooker, not having a valve to let people escape, is that you end up this mixed population that includes sketchy young men and some criminals, yes, and that sort of thing mixed in to this group. It's not good for anybody to be doing that. But I met so many Afghans who'd realized their only choice, they'd all applied for asylum in various Western countries, often the countries that they'd worked with in Afghanistan, and realized that, for Canada, it can take 5 or 6 years, even if you're in an emergency situation. And you're stuck, the police, having to pay off the police with bribes not to deport your children and that sort of thing. A lot of them do this or consider doing this. Maria did, and her son, Orhan, was a newborn baby. It was something like 8 months old when the Taliban took over. And she left her other son, who was 6 at the time, with relatives in Afghanistan, and carried her nursing baby across the border into Iran, and paid smugglers, hung out in Tehran for 21 days, and paid smugglers to take her across the border of Turkey. They got busted after paying a lot of money, jailed for quite some time, and then told, we'll do terrible things to you if you come back to Iran. Kicked back into Afghanistan, where as a former intelligence agent, she knew, so she snuck across Afghanistan, grabbed her other kid and a couple of her sisters and her mother, and they now live in hiding in Quetta, there right by the Khyber Pass in northern Pakistan, and so on. And I met so many people who'd attempted this route. And it's one of the things about conflict migration, because this is a conflict migration. It's war migration. These are war refugees. But the war is over. And one of the things that we and our governments often don't recognize is that conflict migration doesn't always happen during the conflict. Sometimes it does. The Syrian war, the Ukraine invasion are producing refugees as the bombs are falling. But a lot of conflicts, the big movements take place after the shooting stops. That's true of the Second World War. The refugee crisis that caused us to invent the word refugee in its modern sense was the many, many millions, probably tens of millions, who became refugees after the war had ended. Vietnam War, same thing. And the Afghanistan war, it's turned out that's the case. The largest movement of Afghans in the last 40 years is those who left after the conflict because the bad guys took over. And we don't tend to tool up our refugee systems, our welcome systems, and also our diplomatic efforts to try to fund reception in neighboring countries. I'll get into this later, but it's not, you can't solve these problems by making everyone a refugee who goes to a Western country. A lot of them don't want it. It's better to solve it by creating the conditions where neighboring countries, where people feel at home, can become at home. And we can see examples where that's happened. Now, I'm going to switch over to a second category of movements. I spent September on the trans-Saharan pathways, specifically in Morocco. And there actually are not that many ways to cross the Sahara. And again, you generally have to pay smugglers to help you with this, to get across the various borders and so on. For a very long time, people seeking work in West Africa and to some lesser extent sub-Saharan Africa, like in Central Africa, have been crossing along those routes to do work in North Africa and occasionally in Europe. But most of the Africans who cross the Sahara on this route, which is a grueling route, whether you have usually a series of weird mini buses and some walking and who knows what else, are doing it to get work in the wealthier countries of North Africa, in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Libya used to be very popular for this. It's now everybody knows that it's very dangerous, and you could get jailed and tortured and so on. But so about 85% today, about 85% of the Africans who travel that route are seeking work in North Africa. But of course, what makes the headlines is those who are seeking to go to Europe, and it's often a mixed set of motives. And I think there's an image that it's the poor countries, that it's countries who have no economy, that it's the dirt poor who are flooding out of failed countries to go. And that's not really the case. The very poorest countries don't tend to produce very much international migration except to adjoining countries, immediately adjoining countries. In fact, it's when countries rise above a certain level of economic development that they start producing international labor-seeking migration. And you see that when you go to the villages that people come from, it's not only the villages that are more prosperous that tend to produce international labor migrants, but it tends to be the families who have some savings and that sort of thing. Not middle class in any sense of the word, but it's not poverty. Poverty reduces the ability to migrate internationally. And I'll try to mention later, another section of this series I found, climate change dramatically reduces the ability of people to migrate. So who are the people who are getting on the boats? This is a guy I wrote about. You may have read about it. I just texted him today. His name's Khalifa Jallo. He's from Guinea. I met him when he was 17, and he had walked across the Sahara once and was preparing to walk back because he had spent, he was 14 when he started, left his village in Guinea, You could say he was an adventure seeker, but there was a sense in his village that if you don't get to somewhere with a better economy and get some work, there's nothing for you here and that sort of thing. And he was fluent in English, had a reasonably good education in a country where French is the main language, but he was interested in English. Had a series of just horrendous situations and misadventures and so on, but and like many young people, he did try to go to Europe, and it was quite sensible to try to go to Europe because there are jobs in Europe. There is huge demand for agricultural laborers in Italy and Spain especially, and huge labor shortages in those areas, and there's a great need for it. And until about 2000, Black Africans would go to Europe to do agricultural work the conventional way. They would fly to an airport on a cheap flight with a work visa, a seasonal work visa, and they would work legally. But then the EU in the 90s got rid of those work visa regimes, and they really restricted the ability to get visas for Africans. And that's when, starting around 2003, the cross-Mediterranean rubber boat traffic started in earnest. It really wasn't much of a thing before that. And that's when the deaths started as well, because it's an extremely bad way to try to get across. It's extremely risky. It's expensive. You pay a guy $3,000. These guys also are not. They don't tend to be criminals or anything like that. I mean, occasionally there are guys who do other sketchy things as well, but it tends to be people from the same communities who see a need and are enabling people. And Khalifa tried that. Well, he tried it a different way. He tried to walk across. There's a couple of little cities in the north of Spain, north of Morocco, that are Spanish territory. And so technically, once you're on that territory, you could theoretically apply for asylum or something like that, and a way to get in. In practice, you're more likely to get beaten by clubs and so on. And there was a huge crisis 2 years ago when a whole bunch of West African guys tried to jump the fence, and the police went after them and killed a large number, something like 70, in this event. And Khalifa was there that day, and he says he got over the fence and he realized I've made a terrible mistake and so on, and that even if he did make it, it wouldn't be any kind of life. Somebody from Guinea is not going to qualify for asylum or refugee status in Europe. You're not. It's not a country at conflict. You're not wanted for political reasons or something like that. Just being poor is not a reason to be a refugee. So you'd get a few months in Europe and you'd get kicked out. And he realized, no, I'd rather do it the right way. So at the point when I met him, he was crossing the Sahara back again, and made it back eventually. He's now in Sierra Leone, finishing his last year of high school, and so on. I ran a crowdfunding campaign to get him a motorcycle so he could make some money as a delivery driver and that sort of thing. I don't know if some of you here participated in that, but that helped him a bit. I mean, he did me favors too. He took fantastic videos and photos during his Saharan crossing and so on. But European countries have actually found ways around this problem. Spain, for a while in the late 2000s, early 2010s, had a policy, and they still have parts of this policy, to create legal pathways to allow a limited number of people, like 100,000 a year or something, to come across as legal agricultural workers and have a pathway to citizenship even. And for a while, that pretty much eliminated the boat crossings on the route to Spain. The route to Lampedusa in Italy continued to be problematic until Italy paid off various nasties who run Libya and this is the current European policy, is to pay the regimes, particularly in Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, to beat back. And when I say beat back, I mean beat back people trying to get close to the shore. Basically, if you're black and you try to get close to the shore, the police will come and beat you and drive you out to the middle of the desert and dump you. So, and lots of European tax dollars are paying for that. And meanwhile, the agricultural companies in Spain and Italy need these people, so they keep trying to come. Morocco has taken a slightly better route in that it's recognized that it actually needs them for its own agriculture, which it's growing. So it is doing some things to try to encourage West Africans to settle in Morocco as agricultural workers and paths to it. Partly also because there's European money for that, but it's a much nicer way. Anyway, it's all avoidable. There's not a lot of reason for there to have to be that kind of traffic. There will always be some people who will attempt dangerous crossings and that sort of thing, but the big numbers are strictly caused because there's a disconnect between the economic needs of Europe and the way that borders are controlled, forcing people. So Spain has legal work for West Africans. You can legally employ them, but it doesn't currently have legal crossing or entry for West Africans. So they can be legally hired to work in the plasticultura farms, the plastic sheet farms that cover the south of Spain. But the only way they can get to that legal job is getting on a rubber raft and paying someone a lot of money. When you've paid someone $3,000 to take you on a rubber raft for a job that pays $4 an hour, you can't just stay seasonally like Africans used to and go back. You have to work for quite a few years. So the policies have turned temporary, legal, safe, seasonal migration into long-term, illegal, dangerous migration. And we see that in a lot of countries where the disconnect between the economic needs of the country and the border policies are forcing people into dangerous pathways. I would say that to a much lesser degree is partly the case in Canada as well. Now, another category, the one I started the series with, is failed state migration. Afghanistan could be described as failed state migration as well, except unless you talk to anyone there. The biggest example, Haiti, of course, is producing a lot of people fleeing for very good reasons. Cuba has as well. But the populations are not as large as Venezuela. Nothing comes close in the world to Venezuela as far as a failed state is concerned. And the point starting around 2015, when an illegitimate regime took over, very corrupt, basically destroyed the economy and caused first the entire middle class to leave, and now just about anybody, because you can't eat and so on, to leave the country, has sent close to 8 million people now fleeing. And about, I was going to say half, but just less than half, about 3 million of them are living next door in Colombia. And Colombia has done, partly because Canada and the United States and a number of other countries have done a lot of work to finance this and to make it possible. Colombia has done what Pakistan should have done, which is it's recognized Venezuelans as being similar people from similar backgrounds. It's generally welcomed them. It's allowed them to settle. It's allowed their kids to enroll in their schools. It's allowed them access to the medical system, and it's allowed them to get permanent residency and eventually citizenship. Now, there's a history behind that. Colombia, a generation ago, was the failed state that was producing tons of refugees, and a lot of them settled in Venezuela, which was the successful, stable country. So millions of Colombians had the experience of having to settle in Venezuela. Venezuela, under governments of, Colombia, under governments of different ideologies, has consistently welcomed the Venezuelans. there's some pressure, there's some tensions. I mean, if you have more than 3 million people suddenly settle in your country in a couple of years, you're going to have some tensions, but surprisingly little. There are another 1.5 million Venezuelans settled in Peru, none of them legally. Peru isn't quite being as nice. 500,000 each in Chile, Ecuador, and Brazil. Poor countries that don't have it easy. The United States, to this point, has had 400,000 come in, and most of them, the middle class ones, by flying in and applying for asylum from an embassy or something, but most of them large numbers of them by making the crossing north there, which is an extraordinarily dangerous crossing. When I was there, I couldn't just listen to people interview. I did spend a good amount of time when I was on the northern shore there, as people were getting ready to take the boat across to Panama, telling people, please don't do this. You have to spend 6 days walking across the Darien Gap, the most heavy rainfall piece of uncharted jungle in the world. People who were crossing it, once they got across, would send me photos of human corpses they had to step across and that sort of thing. And then your troubles begin, right? Then you have to cross the most messed up countries of Central America. And anyway, I've got an example that we'll talk about. So that small share who go north, here, I'll tell you the example of Carly Vasquez. She began the article that I wrote about, and is another person I've stayed in touch with pretty much again, I texted with her this morning. And the Vasquez family were not particularly wealthy people from Venezuela, crossed into Colombia, had an okay living there, but then had troubles because part of the family was part of a criminal gang called Tren de Aragua, which preys on Venezuelan migrants along the route. This is the thing. There is crime in crisis migration, in refugee migration, but most of the crime is directed at the migrants and refugees themselves. There are gangs that prey on migrants, try to force them into labor, particularly on women, forced into prostitution, these sort of things. Carolee was in a relationship with a man who was in this gang in Colombia, and realized one day when her kid, Grike, was a baby, that this was very dangerous for her. He was trying to force her into criminality. So she fled, following the routes that a lot of Venezuelans take. She went south to Ecuador, and for the next 4 years, lived in 8 different countries in South America, 6 different countries in South America, trying to settle, find regular work. Either was driven out by those countries not wanting Venezuelans, or by the Tren de Aragua gang wanting to get at her for having left, and that sort of thing. She had a target on her back. She had a pretty successful time in Lima for about 6 months, loved living there, got the kid in daycare, all that sort of thing, and then suddenly had an encounter with the gang and had to get on the road, and really literally lived on the road for 4 years, often walking from country to country with little Grike, and sleeping on the road sometimes, and that sort of thing. The distance that they walked was just extraordinary. Then got an opportunity when realized that some of their family who are also having troubles, had decided to try the route going north. They were going to cross the Darien Gap. So that's when I met the Vasquez family. Here they are in a tent on a beach on the Caribbean coast of Colombia, where you get onto a speedboat that takes you to the bottom of the Darien Gap in Panama, and hooks you up with smugglers who you walk across the gap with. And about 12 of this family were going. She eventually broke off from the rest of the family, who she didn't have great relations with, and it became her and her fiance, a guy a decent guy she'd met in South America, and her son, who at that point was 4. Grike had walked with his little backpack across so many countries. And that was when we started communicating, because she was very good at narrating her story and taking photographs and that sort of thing. And she said, why don't I chronicle the family's story as they went north? And here they are right after they got across the Darien Gap after 6 days. She did send me photos of human corpses and that sort of thing that I will not show you. Thank you very much. And then discovered that Central America, and she was not trying to get to the United States specifically. And most of her family weren't. They actually, their first choice was Spain. They hoped to apply for asylum in Spain. The embassies in Bogota were clogged up. It took days to get access to any of them. You couldn't reach the Canadian embassy or the Spanish embassy. So they hoped to be able to apply for asylum somewhere along the route. And also just everyone was going north. So this was after the pandemic restrictions came off. And also everyone along the route knew about the changing US policies, right? And knew about the border policies. And there was always stuff during 2022 and early 2023 that Biden's about to change the policy, or he's about to toughen it, and you have a few weeks to try to get north. So people were being propelled north by week-to-week changes in U.S. policy, and I'll talk a little bit about how that affected them. But they tried to apply for asylum in Panama, Costa Rica, basically all of the Central American countries. And a lot of them, like Nicaragua, don't have any UN agencies. They've become such messed up, failed states that even the UN doesn't operate there. So you can't even apply for the UNHCR. They had to shut down their office and get out. A lot of them are horrifically corrupt. You generally have to pay a bribe of something like $50 per family member, $50 US, to get across the borders of each of those countries, to have somebody take you through the forest around the border crossing. And then you often have to pay a bus to take you across at an extortionate rate if you're a person without papers. They didn't have papers because Venezuela now charges the equivalent of about $800 US per family member to have a passport issued. So in fact, we made an effort to get them passports when they were in Mexico, and they realized it was impossible. And indeed, in Mexico, they'd hoped to be able to apply at an embassy for Canada or Spain or pretty much any country, the United States. Canada and Spain made it clear that they didn't have any procedure that would take less than a year and possibly 2 years, even for emergency humanitarian asylum. And I know about this because as somebody who works for the Globe and Mail, we tried to get our staff out of Afghanistan when the Taliban took over, because they were in extreme danger because they'd worked for Western organizations. And we couldn't get them into Canada. Even with meetings with the minister, it would have taken way too long. It would have taken at least a year or something like that. And we actually, my colleague Mark McKinnon actually ended up striking a deal with some guys in Ukraine who are associated with the government to get them asylum at the beginning of 2022 in Ukraine, which out of the frying pan into the fire. They're now safely in Canada after some more string pulling and so on. So Canada was, you could not hang out and wait in Mexico for a year. This family Carolee and her boyfriend and little Grike got kidnapped by a cartel right after they crossed the border into Mexico, held by them for a few days, and managed to run away and escape before things. I got worried because I didn't have a text from them for several days and freaked out. And at that point, I realized that I couldn't just be an observer of this. I actually helped crowdfund some money to get them buses across Mexico and that sort of thing. And why did they go across Mexico? Why do so many Venezuelans go across Mexico when crossing physically into the United States is so dangerous and so on? Well, you can't apply for asylum practically This has improved a little in the last year, but you could not apply for asylum in third countries. Technically, there are ways to do third country asylum applications on the road, but none of them can be done quickly. You can apply with the UNHCR. Some countries recognize the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as being able to register refugees in the country for them. Most don't, and you have to be registered with the UNHCR for Canada to see you as a refugee. And then you begin a process that's kind of broken now. You really couldn't get in. The United States, Biden introduced an app designed to solve a lot of these problems so that migrants could apply for asylum status on this app, or could apply for an appointment to apply for asylum status using an app on the phone. The app was designed so it would not work until you were north of Mexico City. And so you had to, and a lot of people were getting on trains. And by on trains, I mean freight trains. They would get their family on top of the freight train. There is a hospice in Mexico just for South American and Haitian and whatever migrants who've lost legs on those trains, that has dozens of them and so on. I didn't really want that to happen to these guys. So thus the bus fundraising. But they didn't want to go to the United States. They did not want to go to the Mexico-US border. They did not want to be illegal immigrants, as the Americans say. But it became the only option because this app would only let you apply for an appointment to register for refugee status north of Mexico City. And the appointment had to be at one of the US missions in the cities along the Mexico-US border. So Ciudad Juarez and places like that. And they got there, and after considerable misadventures, and Carolee had been able to basically live on the road, because what they would do is, she's very entrepreneurial. So whenever they got to a new city in some Central American capital or something like that, she would look at the crowds on the streets and look at what was going on. And then she would go to, like, if she saw that there were a lot of children in the public square, she would go and buy balloons and sticker books and things like that at a wholesale store, and would sell those things on the street. Or if there was a lot of people who seemed to need bottled water, she would find cheap bottled water and sell that. Or very often she'd make empanadas in whatever room she'd rented and sell those on the street and that sort of thing. And she discovered on the Mexican-US border that you could not do that. And she'd sort of like, because she had an appointment registered for in Matamoros on the Mexico-US border, but the appointment would be, didn't say when, it was typically 6 to 12 months. You had to live in a city on the a Mexican city, and wait for an appointment at the mission. And the problem is those cities are controlled by cartels, which are vicious. And they do not allow South Americans to do street vending. They will employ you for various things they like to employ you for if you want. So you have to live basically in hiding of those. And she actually got rented a nice house and so on with savings from what she'd done and so on, and had it all set up, bought an electric hot plate for making empanadas and that sort of thing, was all prepared to run a business, and then discovered that you cannot even walking to a shop is a little dangerous with the cartels, and realized that waiting months for that legal asylum appointment wasn't going to work. And so she did this, and she spent her last $5 on a rubber air mattress, and that is crappy picture taken on one of her friend's phones, but of her with the little boy crossing the Rio Grande on a rubber raft, where they were immediately arrested on the other side, which they expected, and they turned themselves into the authorities. They were held in, fortunately Trump wasn't in power, so she did not get separated from her child. But they were held for a few days in immigration detention center, and then released into southern Texas. And this was spring of about a year ago. And the Texas governor was and still is solving this problem of people coming in. And it is a big number. It is a tricky number of people for the southern states. But his solution was to buy them plane tickets to New York City and Chicago, because New York City and Chicago voted for the Democratic Party. And so they got their first ever airplane flight, first to Detroit. It was a cheap flight, so Detroit, New York City. And I got a text from Carly about a year ago saying, I'm in this place called LaGuardia. What do I do? And I did some scrambling, and thank God for Uber. And they went to the refugee reception center in the Bronx. She had a brother who was already living in a refugee shelter who had come across a couple of years before, so didn't know nobody. But at that point, New York City was being deluged with huge numbers of people. The New York mayor has been mixed about this, but New York's various authorities have actually been very good. And eventually they got a spot in New York, took about some huge number of hotels, like 100 major hotels, and turned them into refugee shelters for Venezuelans. And so they have, for the last year, been living in a single hotel room in what had been a boutique hotel in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which sounds nice to some of us, but it's one of the places in the United States where groceries are most expensive. Imagine if Whole Foods Market is the only nearby place where you can get food, and have been trying to make a go of it and apply for asylum and so on, not having wanted to be either in the United States necessarily as their first choice, or certainly not as illegal immigrants. New York is pretty good, though. You get health insurance, you can get a driver's license, you can work as an undocumented person, and so on. So she works at a restaurant, and her entire goal, as she was, walking across all these countries with little Grike, was she was just terrified that they were still going to be on the road and he was going to be school aged, and so on. Was to get him in school while he was, of that age. So, in September it happened. And so that's public school, 380 in Brooklyn, that does have a special program and did admit him. And he's had a fairly normal life and has been in school. So it's happy ending sort of, except things are still really messed up for them in ways that I won't get into. And that's one family. And what's interesting is that none of that needed to happen, right? And their interactions with various countries' border policies and immigration policies should have produced a different result. There should have been more countries than Colombia that would welcome the 8 million and that got financing from wealthier countries to be able to settle them and get them engaged in the economy and the schools and so on. There should have been lots of things to make it unnecessary to go north. And assuming that there's going to be some number who are going to go to the United States, and to a much lesser extent Canada, there should have been ways to apply for asylum in countries like Canada or the United States without having to go to the borders. And this is true of the Canada's southern border as well. A lot of those people should be flying to an airport and applying for asylum. Maybe half of them would be refused. And it does, in Canada, like in most countries, you do have the right to appeal, because we have due process rights to. The little thing about the Constitution in Canada and a number of other countries is that our fundamental rights don't apply to Canadians. If you read the Constitution, they apply to people in Canada. So if you physically set foot in Canada, you have the charter right to due process, which means not only can you apply for asylum, but you have the right to appeal that decision. So people do stay for a long time before it's a tricky system. Anyone who's worked in the refugee system, the asylum system, knows that this is tricky. It's much better to try to have ways for people to enter as sponsored refugees or as government resettled refugees, government assisted refugees as they're known, and so on. It shouldn't have to be a walk across 11 countries, as was the case with them, and risking your lives and getting kidnapped and swimming across a river and all this other stuff when you didn't want to do that. So how can it be solved? I mean, basically, as I've said throughout this, first of all, if countries like ours can fund the sort of things that was successfully done in Colombia, to some extent, in more places, most people don't want to fly across the world just to get safety for their family. Canada got a bit of a slap in the face in the early years of Assad's attack on his people in Syria, when we decided to have a special program to resettle some decent number of Syrians to Canada from the refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan. And because Turkey and Jordan were, I mean, the vast bulk of Syrians were and are settled in those Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And so Canada said, we'll take some of them out of the camps, which have become permanent settled. You know, they'd had high schools and generations had been born in the camps and that sort of thing. And something like 6 out of 10 Syrians who were given the opportunity to resettle to Canada said no. And it was like, why wouldn't anyone want to come to Canada? And they'd Googled Canada, and they didn't know anyone in Canada. And it looked harsh and all that. And it's sort of slow recognition that not everyone wants to come to Canada, even when they're fleeing a conflict. And it's partly because flight migration and crisis migration, they are just immigration. And trying to distinguish between labor migrants and refugees and so on is very tricky, because everyone needs to find a way to make a living and support their families and so on. So anyone fleeing war needs to have a house and get a job and that sort of thing. And I've found that when migrants around the world try to decide where to settle, there's 3 things they want to find. One is known work or entrepreneurship opportunities. Usually, somebody on a smartphone tells you can get a job doing this, or if you sell these things, there's a market. 2 is people from the same community or at least language group as you, living near you, who can. It's not just a matter of comfort, it's a matter of they can help you out and loan you money and stuff like that. And the third thing is housing they can afford. And the one thing that people will always drop is number 3, right? There's a reason why immigrants who succeed settle in unaffordable cities rather than affordable cities. It's because those first 2 things are present there. And whatever makes housing affordable in a city means there's no economy, there's no networks of people to support you, and so on. Germany made this mistake of trying to resettle a lot of Syrians in messed up former coal mining towns of former East Germany and that sort of thing. And the sensible ones stayed for a year and then moved to somewhere where they could open a little restaurant or something like that in a very different part of Germany and so on. But we need to recognize that most people don't want to fly across the world. So roundabout way of saying that creating situations in adjoining countries that make them more welcoming and more accepting, and sometimes just giving them money to do that, can take a lot of the pressure off. But the second thing is creating pathways for people to enter. We have lots of experiences in countries that have had torrents of people crossing in boats and that sort of thing, in recognizing that if you have 200,000 people coming a year in a very dangerous, illegal way, creating a pathway that has 40,000 legal jobs where you can just fly over will actually take off most of that pressure. And those 200,000 won't come because most of those people, a 1 in 3 chance, is better than spending $3,000 to risk your life for something that might be even less of a chance. So creating a very limited legal pathway often can completely eliminate, or at least reduce to a very low level, the much larger illegal pathway, and so on. And we also know that it's a little bit of whack-a-mole. Trying to close dangerous illegal border crossing points drives people to much more dangerous, even more illegal crossing points. And we know that with the Canadian border as well. The numbers are pretty tiny compared to any of these other countries. But we do know that closing points, closing dangerous points forces people to, try to cross the mountains in the snow, or cross from North Dakota to Saskatchewan in the middle of the winter or something like that. That is not good. And meanwhile, you could just have a little office at the border, at a legal border crossing, where people can apply, and maybe they will get rejected or accepted, but people will take that. People will take that 50-50 chance over risking their families' lives. And in England, they know that too. There's a huge political crisis. I'm British as well, so I pay attention to this, involving boats of asylum seekers and various migrants of various sorts trying to cross the English Channel, none of whom would be in those boats if they went back to what they had 20 years ago, which is a center in France where you could apply for asylum in Britain and maybe get rejected. Maybe it's about 50% who are eligible. And but they didn't want to have a political situation where you're having legal applications for asylum there, so it drives people onto the boats. Anyway, there are things that could be done. And the other thing to recognize is what I said at the beginning, that this is a limited scope problem. It's only a few countries that are producing this, and they are all conflicts that are going to, and situations that will end at some point, hopefully in a favorable way. Stabilizing those countries, ending the conflicts, of course, helps. And that the numbers are finite, the duration is finite. Refugee and road people flows have dropped to negligible, near zero levels for periods of the entire 2000s, and then up again, and then down again. They will go down again, and we can make them happen. In the meantime, it's worth looking into resettling people and helping people. Canada does have a sponsorship-based refugee system. Many of you here have probably helped out Syrians and Ukrainians and people like that. It's not going to solve these crises at all numerically. It literally is a drop in the bucket. But helping a specific family out of being stuck on the road, it has great outcomes for all the members of that family and for the network of people attached for them. And so there is good that can be done by individuals in this, and there's better that can be done by countries. But if there's one takeaway from this, I hope, is to recognize that yes, there is a crisis right now, but it's not a generalized immigration crisis. It's a very specific thing involving very specific populations who are stuck, and that there are ways to get them unstuck. So thank you, and I'd be glad to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. Nedra and I are going to take questions now. So she'll be on one side and I'll be on the other. And put your hand up and we'll give you the mic, and Doug will answer your question.
As I often say, you can ask me about anything except why your Globe and Mail didn't come on time this morning. That's above my pay grade.
Okay. Anyone here? Someone here? Okay.
Hello.
Hi, thanks so much. I feel much better that you've scaled the problem for us, and it's not quite as horrendous as I thought. I am wondering about international efforts to collaborate on these ideas that you have, because if one country manages to do those two big simple things you talked about, how are we going to get all the rest to do it as well?
Yeah, and that's why the Colombia example is a good one, because there were international conferences and still are. The last one was last year, of the wealthier countries of North America, and Germany and Spain participate in these conferences as well, of how to help out Colombia and Peru and other neighboring countries in receiving Venezuelans since their crisis began. There's not anything like that for Pakistan, and I don't know the whole history. It's partly because of Pakistan's misgovernment at the moment, but I think it's also because there's not the same sense among European countries and North American countries that this is something to be solved this way. As I said, there is a bit of a mentality, and when you talk to diplomatic people stationed in Pakistan, you hear this. There's a bit of a mentality in countries like ours that the war is over, and that there was a refugee flood in 2021 and early 2022, and that's now over. And if there was one takeaway in that I want people to have from what I saw in Pakistan, is that there's a huge population of people, hundreds of thousands, who are very soon going to be, because of the mass deportation scheme, going to be stuck with no other option but to flee in dangerous ways. So I think the international cooperation that happened around the Venezuelans, it would be good to see that repeated with Sudanese. And also, I mean, certainly the Ukrainian crisis created similar international cooperation about how to receive. The reason why Canada did end up with receiving 200,000 Ukrainians was partly because there was that kind of international meeting and cooperation.
What happened as the crisis happened?
Well, or it doesn't. But there are always various multilateral initiatives to fund things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And I think there needs to be more attention paid to the fact that these things work. That they can happen. It doesn't help if the poor country next door is governed by people who simply don't want those people coming in. And you have to have a certain amount of sympathy for the poor country next door because they're experiencing refugee numbers that we could never even imagine. I mean, certainly Pakistan having, 8 million Afghans over the years makes anything that we've received pale, except, going from that to zero is a very extreme thing to do. And I hate to think that the policies of the United States and Europe helped encourage that sort of thing. The political rhetoric that said we should, one is too many and that sort of thing. I hope that the lessons that people are receiving over social media in the capitals of those countries from North America and Europe are not that this is an acceptable way to do things. I hope the lessons they receive is the type of multilateralism that you talked about.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I've got two questions, one on behalf of my colleague and I, and one on behalf of someone who wasn't able to make it. So first, ours. I'm a statistician at the University of Toronto, and my colleague is a professor at Humber College. And we've actually been working with the Colombian government over the past 9 months with data that they've collected on Venezuelan migration. It's a very unique situation, in part because of the unique circumstances you described. I'm wondering, in these places you visit, how hard or easy is it to get reliable data that's collected from the government that measures these movements? So that's the first question. And the second question, on behalf of Emilio Deja, who's a employee of Northumberland County and who's actively attempting to partner with Colombian agencies to create what you called a welcome center. Do you have any sense of strategies or approaches that have been successful and unsuccessful across Canada as communities have tried to create welcome centers? Thanks.
Thank you. And I would actually love to see your work. So please get in touch with me because I'd like to see the Colombian information. So Colombia is better for data than most Latin American countries are. But it still is spotty. And to be fair, there are academic organizations and advocacy organizations in Colombia that do a better job aggregating and keeping data sometimes than the government agencies do. I spent some time trying to get figures. Now, to be fair, it's a moving target. The border of Venezuela and Colombia, for most of the crisis, has been officially closed. So, and it's a very porous border, and you can just walk across a lot of it fairly safely, not like other borders, and or you can bribe someone and that sort of thing, which makes it very difficult for them to know how many people there are. And there are a lot of agencies that have tried to do censuses and that sort of thing of who's on the road, who's coming in, and who's coming out. But that's hard to say. What there are good statistics on are the Venezuelans who are settling in Colombia, because there's benefits to registering yourself, right? You can register in schools, you can register for the medical system, and so on. So there's what seem to be good statistics on that are trustable, but they don't always line up. The UNHCR, the UNHCR has an entire bureaucracy that, and the IOM as well, that count people crossing borders and count people showing up in camps and count people going down roads. And those numbers don't always line up with the Colombian numbers and so on. Within Canada, so there are the examples recently that look good in Canada involve Ukrainians. But there were also a lot of good examples involving Syrians as well. Now, that said, I don't think the sponsorship system is working very well in Canada. And most of those examples of communities that have come together to sponsor large numbers of people is in spite of the workings of the system rather than because of it. Now, just as a background for everybody, Canada's sponsorship system is kind of unique in the world. And it was created in 1956 to deal with the Soviet invasion of Hungary. And there was a lot of sympathy for the Hungarians who were being driven out. But Ottawa and the agencies working with Ottawa were distrustful of Hungarian refugees. And we know that because historians have found memos within Ottawa at the time saying we should watch it with any idea of resettlement because some of them may be communist, and even messages saying some of them may be Jewish, which a significant number were. And so there was intolerance in official positions, but community groups in Canada, including church groups and so on, came together and said, we want to bring in Hungarians. And of course, a very large number, something like 60,000 Hungarians were brought in that year, and it created the sponsorship system and the model of organizations. There's a limited number. It's interesting looking at refugee resettlement numbers in Canada. Alberta has by far the largest, as a percentage of population, refugee resettlement numbers in Canada. And at first I thought, when I saw that figure, and I forget what scholar put that together, my first thought was, oh, it's Ukrainians. There's all sorts of Ukrainian Canadians in Alberta that are sponsoring Ukrainians. But it turns out that actually with Syrians and with Somalis and lots of other groups, Alberta also actually has a higher percentage. And it may just be a civic culture of that sort of thing. Now, these are resettlement numbers, which is different from sponsorship. About half of Canada's refugees are resettled. But nevertheless, it looks like Alberta similarly is higher. There were communities in Ontario, communities in the Maritimes that have come together very well. And often it's been a matter not just of trying to settle people and find housing and that sort of thing, but of fighting a bureaucratic system that really puts a lot of roadblocks in the way of efficiency and so on. And I don't think that's any fault. I mean, look, I've met lots of people who work on this. It's not from a lack of goodwill. It's from it's plain old understaffing. and we don't have the capacity to handle it. And partly the Ukrainian crisis did take up a lot of capacity in Ottawa, that made it, that created backlogs for other groups and so on. So I haven't traveled across Canada to see it. I'd like to find good examples of welcoming situations. I've seen it in Europe. It's been very interesting to see welcoming situations in smaller towns and so on. There I found examples of small agricultural towns in the Netherlands and Germany and so on that said, we have a problem in our town because we need someone to run the local shop or hotel or whatever, and everyone's leaving our town instead of coming. Let's look at this refugee crisis as an opportunity and ask to have some people settle there. And sometimes it works out well. Sometimes there are tensions that emerge. Bringing in traumatized people from a war is not always the easiest way to solve an economic problem in Canada. But it's kind of the little mosque on the prairie phenomenon in Canada. That shows about rural towns that had one, family from Pakistan take over the one shop and that sort of thing. Anyone who's traveled across the prairies knows that's a thing. And often those people, even if they came through regular immigration channels, were refugees of one sort or another as well. There's a funny thing in Canada that a lot of people consider their family background to be regular old immigration. Were fleeing some form of discrimination or conflict or something that would have made them qualify as a refugee if that had existed. So the refugee experience is much more common to our backgrounds than I think. Anyway, I would like to know more about good examples of that. I've not been on the ground in Canada enough to see, and I would like to hear about it. So I'd like to hear from you. Please, next question.
In 2 minutes or less, what do you do to protect yourself while you're traveling on these dangerous roads?
I work with people who are members of the communities who are in flight. And if you're with the people who know the community and know the dangers, then you're not just some white guy with a notepad, and so on, and you collaborate with them. That work in Pakistan I did with Zia Rehman, that really wasn't me going and hiring some translators and fixers. That was a group of us collaborating on some journalists, one of whom was an Afghan refugee, Wajma Hamidi, 21-year-old Afghan refugee we hired to get us to meet the families, and especially female-led families who were trapped in Pakistan, who will herself become a Canadian someday because of her own refugee journey and her family's trajectory. But I have not felt in danger, generally. I felt in danger of getting kicked out of the country. That's the privilege of being the reporter from the Western newspaper. The worst that happens to you is you get kicked out of the country. I got kicked out of part of Morocco. I got kicked out of some towns in Vietnam by the local workers' committees and that sort of thing. But that's the worst. So yeah.
As a longtime subscriber of the Globe and Mail, most of my information comes from immigration from the Globe and Mail. And I noticed that you haven't talked about Southeast Asian migration and Chinese migration, because I believe those numbers are what is overwhelming our country today. Well,
because I'm not really talking about immigration, but about refugees and crisis migration, that's a little bit outside the scope. It's actually hard to get Chinese immigration right now, just because there's the numbers of people who are seeking to emigrate is limited. The big now, last I checked, the big populations who come to Canada through normal immigration channels, Filipinos are a big population. and Bangladeshis. China has been in the top 5 many times over the last few years, although Philippines has been number 1 for most of the last 20 years, actually. Iran, good numbers, and so on. It tends to have to do with family networks. Because Canada has established paths of Chinese migration, because Canadians have been of Chinese ancestry since the 19th century, there do tend to be patterns of sponsorship and mutual support. There are connections between particular urban areas in Guangdong and specific neighborhoods in Canada and so on. But yeah, now in terms of student migration, student visas, that's another thing. But students are a kind of weird special case in the last couple of years, which I think has now come to an end after some wildness.
One more here, Doug?
Can you explain, please, the issue of the Roxton Road immigrants? Because if they're flying into the US and then getting a bus to the Canadian border and coming across, why wouldn't they fly directly to Canada? What's the process there?
Because we won't issue them a visa. You can't get on a plane to Canada without a visa.
Okay. So then when they get to the crossing between the US and Canada, what happens then?
Then you step across the physical, it's not a crossing. The whole crisis with these points between legal border crossings is that they are between legal border crossings. Because if you go to a border crossing and you don't have a visa, or you're not from a country that allows visa-free travel to Canada, then you won't be let in. And we don't have a way to, you can apply for asylum at an airport after you land at an airport. Mm-hmm. And in fact, visas will often be denied to people from certain countries, even if they're scholars coming to present at a conference or athletes here to perform, because federal authorities will say, we believe that when you land here, you're going to apply for asylum.
Right.
Therefore, we won't issue a visa for this conference or whatever. And so people try to go between crossings and step across the border, because once you're physically in Canada, you can apply for asylum. And ideally, that's done somewhere safe. And ideally, it can be done without having to step into Canada. You could apply in Mexico or something like that. Theoretically, you can at a Canadian embassy, but it's an incredibly difficult process. Certainly, there are a number of reasons why you do not want people doing this, crossing between legal border crossings. First of all, it's very dangerous for them. When they shut down Roxton Road, it drives people to extremely dangerous places, taking canoes across the St. Lawrence. And I should stress, the numbers of people coming to Canada and trying to sneak across the border to the United States are higher than those trying to sneak from the United States into Canada. That's the larger crisis. The Americans are freaked out about this. But first of all, it's dangerous. But second of all, it's politically dynamite. Images of people walking across the border, even though it's 0.01% of all refugees, never mind, and that's less than 10% of immigrants, the sight of people walking across the border creates political calamities in Canada. The only thing that's worth is news that a boat has shown up. Like we had a number of boatloads of Sri Lankan Tamils during the 2000s who arrived on the shores of Vancouver. And there was a famous incident involving a boatload of Sikhs and so on. And that, for some reason, just creates a calamity. And it's a bit like, I mean, Canada's not unique in this sense. The Americans, of course, really get freaked out about people on their southern border. Europeans really worry about boats. British don't like boats across the channel and so on, even though these are minuscule numbers compared to the people that are actually legally coming in. Because it's political dynamite and because it's dangerous for people, it's important to create ways for people to apply that don't involve that.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you everyone who had questions. It's 9 o'clock, and I think, obviously there's so much to talk about. We could make you sit here for an hour, and that's not fair. So, I'd like to thank you for a presentation of such depth. It reflected your passion for the work you do, which is awe-inspiring to all of us. We're so fortunate to have heard from you as we begin our exploration of migration. Next week, social scientist Melissa Kelly will talk about what happens when immigrants arrive in Canada and where they are settling in Canada outside of the major cities, something that you referred to.
That might answer one of the questions
It
we
might
got.
answer
Yes.
one of the questions. That's right. We expect that material next week to be of great interest to our own MPP and the Minister of Immigration for the province of Ontario, David Piccini, who plans to attend as an audience member. Not a speaker, not a politician. We invited him because we thought he would like to hear what our speaker has to say and your questions, of course, as well. So we hope that you will all come back. A few small housekeeping items. If you haven't had a chance to speak to our dedicated volunteers at the Connectors Desk about how you can be a regular supporter of NLC, please do so on your way out. And this is a plea that I make every week. If you like what we do, if you find it interesting, we'd love to hear from you about getting involved with NLC. We need you. So thank you so much, Doug Saunders, for being with us tonight. And thank you, Liz, for coming along. And everyone drive safe, and we'll see you next week. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.